All right. Good evening, everyone. All right. I'm excited to get started on a new study, and I pray that you will go on this journey with me. It'll take us a little bit of time, but nothing like studying the book of Acts, nothing like studying the book of John. We should be able to finish our study on how we got the Bible and how to study the Bible, some tips on studying the Bible. We should be able to do that within this quarter. And so that is my goal. And so while this particular lesson can get somewhat tedious in dealing with history, and a lot of it comes from outside of the Bible. This is about, Neil Lightfoot writes about this question, how do we get the Bible? He writes about that this is as much about the journey as it is the end product. And so it is hopefully a faith-building type of lesson. That is, every time that I've had opportunity to study this, it really has helped me in many ways, and so I hope that it will benefit you in that way as well, that it will be faith building, and you may have questions along the way, and so I know that in this type of lesson especially, I'm going to be giving you probably a lot of information, and so hopefully you'll be taking notes. We should have a PowerPoint for each of the lessons as we go through it. But I know that there's much more than I can put on PowerPoint. There's much more that you can take in one particular lesson. So you may have questions, and if you do, come to me after class. If it's a particular lesson dealing with what we're studying right then, ask that question. I don't mind that at all. But I know how I get in this type of study, and you probably know how I get in study, and I'm moving along, and so it may not seem like there's a good time for a question, but raise your hand, we'll make time. I don't mind that at all. So how did we get the Bible? That's the question. So where do we start on this type of study? And I think it goes back to the fact that, again, like Lightfoot stated, it is a story of adventure. It is one of both toil and faith. It is one that sometimes it has come at great cost to individuals. It is one that has been passed down from generation to generation, that message of salvation. And so how is it that we have come to have the Bible that we have in front of us right now? Well, it didn't start off looking like this. And so that's really what we want to get to by way of the Bible's history and this journey. And it is quite an amazing story. And so, again, there's some things that are, a good portion of this is going to be extra biblical information. And I'll do my very best to give you some tools, some references that you can study as well. But Neil R. Lightfoot, who has written, I think, a tremendous volume by that same title, How Did We Get the Bible? It is published by Abilene Christian some years back, and it is an excellent study. Geisler and Nix are two outstanding writers who have written a great deal about this type of information as well, pertaining to how we got the Bible, pertaining to inspiration of the Bible and things like that. It's a volume that is about this thick. Nice little hardbound edition that's about this thick. So it is good and detailed, but it is about general biblical information and introduction. General Biblical Introduction is the name of the book itself. But anyway, there's 3 or 4 others that I may reference pretty regularly along the way, and I should have brought those books out here and you could have seen those books, but anyway, I'll try to bring them out next week, or if you want to stop by my office afterwards, you can certainly check those out. I know that there are probably a lot of questions. I know I get asked questions, sometimes having to do with certain books of the Bible. How does that book fit in? And how do we know that that particular book is supposed to be a part of part of Scripture? And so I get a lot of questions like that. And so they come about often. How were these books preserved through the years? How have they been transmitted to us in their present form? And so, and again, I think the answers to this tell an amazing story. And so this is just the starting point, and we've got a journey to go through. And so we're not going to get there tonight completely, but we're going to get started on that journey. And so, when it comes to the Bible itself, what we have to realize, we need to know something about the history of ancient books. And we need to know something about the history of ancient writing to get to that point where we can see that, okay, we have a nice leather-bound or even a hardbound edition maybe on the back of a pew. So how is it that we came to this point? And that's what we really want to get to. And so to get there, we've got to start with some history about ancient writing, about ancient books. The Bible is composed of documents which were not only written long ago, but have been transmitted and preserved through the years by means of writing. And so, and this is hopefully going to help in our understanding. Lightfoot writes this. He says, knowing something of the early history of writing and the origin of ancient books will provide hopefully not just an interesting background, but it is going to hopefully contribute immeasurably to our own faith. Just kind of taking his words and playing on that. It's going to help in understanding the birth of the Bible, how we got it. That is going to hopefully help in our own growth in our faith. And so, early writing, let's begin there. The Bible is, by the way, not the oldest of writings. Not at all the oldest example. There are clay tablets that go back around 3000 BC, some that have been dated as much as 3100 BC, and I've got a picture of that later in the lesson, having to do with, and on that, we have hieroglyphs that are on some of those clay tablets, and we'll talk about different types of material that they would write on. But what's interesting is that going all the way back to the earliest pharaoh, his name is mentioned on two of those tablets dated back to 3100 BC. And so that's important for us to know that there was writing at that point in time. And so Egyptian texts dating back even further in hieroglyphs, on monuments, on temples, in tombs, and so forth. And so all those are important things for us to understand. Hieroglyphs are simply a form of picture-type writing. And so they would use a picture to describe maybe someone who's farming, or maybe to describe a battle that took place. And so they're very vivid in some of the details that are given in some of those battles by certain rulers, in particular going back even to that one that's dated all the way back to 3100 BC. But from what is evidenced, it is maybe the best guess that some Semitic person developed an alphabet somewhere between the area of Egypt and Mesopotamia. And so down in the south, Egypt, all the way up into Mesopotamia. So somewhere in that area, you have a Semitic people, and somewhere along the way, they began not just using pictures, hieroglyphs, but using some type of alphabetic script. And so that is somewhere in the time frame of about 1750 BC. And so from that script, all other alphabets have come to be. You have these royal hieroglyphs that are up here. Archaeologists discovered here an oversized inscription that offers a new glimpse into early development and the Egyptian writing system. And it talks about a team from Yale who came about some of this information in the ancient city of El-Kab. This dates to around 3250 BC, and so even going back even further. And so early in the, again, going all the way back into the earliest dynasty of Egypt. And this obviously would have been found in that Nile Valley area, and so at the northern part of Egypt. You have, it gives a picture of competing kingdoms and sometimes battles that took place and so forth. And so obviously these are some of the earliest forms of writing that we have. But you have sometimes this particular one, this royal hieroglyph that is here, is actually about this pharaoh who won this particular battle. And so this is about 27 inches high. And so this would have been probably put up almost as a billboard, if you will, kind of like a big poster that you would find advertising something. And so telling the story. And so this was found as kind of a billboard is what they believe. Evidence best suggests, again, that our alphabetic script, at least, began somewhere around 1750. Someone want to take a guess when the Bible started to be written by Moses? When does Moses fit in on that dating scale, that sliding scale? Anybody? About 1500. You can test me on that one later if you want to, but somewhere around 1500. So somewhere around 250 years before Moses writing the law, before Moses starts being inspired by God to write about the creation, about all of those things that are taking place with Israel and him leading Israel and the law being given and all that, the Torah, the 5 books, the Pentateuch, the books of Moses, the books of law. Before Moses starts writing that, some 250 years, there's already an alphabetic script in place. Now these things are important to note, and I'll show you why here in just a moment. That it has some very important implications for it. You have, actually I'm going to back up to that here for just a moment. You have some very important, I think, implications that are given when it comes to the Bible. And to begin with, you have these different types of writings, and these inscriptions that I'm going to show you, they show up in that area close to where Moses would see that burning bush. And then later go back to receive the law itself at Mount Sinai. So about 50 miles from the area of Sinai, you have these inscriptions. And it may be hard to read. I know the writing on the side there is kind of small. And by the way, this is something that if you'd like a copy of the PowerPoint, I can print these out for you a little bit later. But here's a couple things I think that are important here. You have Sir William Petrie. It says, up to the beginning of this century, the Mesha stele, or the Moabite stone, a royal inscription of king of Moab named Mesha, this is around 850 BC, was the earliest known alphabetic inscription up to some very recent finds. In the winter of 1904 and 1905, Petrie discovered the inscription that is near about 50 miles from the base of Mount Sinai. And so that again, these are some major implications that are there. It goes on to talk about that he, and here's some more pictures of it on the right-hand side here. You have a great deal of these that have been found, and I could really just find a couple of the pictures, but what they would often do is they'll lay some paper over it, and they'll kind of, use a pencil or whatever and kind of show you what actually is on it. And then they'll start scanning these. And when they scan it, you can begin to see some of the pictures that are there. Now, they seem kind of crude to us. But remember, we're talking about a time frame of about 1750 and before this time frame. And so these are Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions that are found. And so up to the point where Petrie found these, the oldest thing that they had found were writings that had been found like from the king of Moab and the Mesha stele. We'll talk about it a little bit later, which has some very interesting information, but it comes later in the story. What's interesting here is that we're talking about that this goes back again to about 1750 in the area of Mount Sinai. Now, here's why this is important, all of this. Writing was practiced centuries, 2.5 centuries, in fact, before Moses would write the law in the vicinity of Sinai. 5 different systems of writing, in fact, are known to have existed in that general area of Syria and Palestine. And so this is in the time of Moses, 5 different systems of alphabetic script were in place at that point in time. Now, what does that all mean for us? It means that it can no longer be assumed that it was impossible for Moses to have written the Pentateuch. Now, I said that there's some very important implications. And this is kind of where this story begins. Because for years, before finding these Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions, folks had a pretty good, especially skeptics, had a pretty good argument saying, well, we have no evidence whatsoever that Moses could have written anything, that he would have known how to write anything, that there was any kind of language to be used as far as him writing anything. And so these were just all passed down orally. That is just not the case. And this proves that. And a point that we'll talk about a little bit later, where was Moses, where was he trained? Where was he brought up? He was brought up in Pharaoh's house. I wonder what kind of education he got. The best. Absolutely the best. A son in Pharaoh's house would have got absolutely the best education that there was at that time. So let me ask us, could Moses have written, knowing that there is 5, at that point in time, 5 alphabetic scripts known at that point in time that have been found and unearthed? And the fact that Moses was trained by the best, is it at least possible that Moses could have written the law? Absolutely. Absolutely. At the very least, we can see that. So, knowing all of this, when we open our Bibles, we know that we're looking at not just one book, but we're reading 66 books, a catalog of books, and some of which were written over 3,400 years ago. And so some came along and suggested that there's no way that the Bible could have been inspired of God. And so they would suggest that these books contain maybe some inspired information or material, but non-inspired information has seeped into that. This is probably one of the most common things that I hear from a skeptic. So as to say, well, okay, we'll give you the benefit of the doubt. Say it is the fact that some of this could have been written and is inspired of God, that this was a message from God that was written down by man. But you have to say, after 3,400 years, certainly some of man's ideas and man's thoughts have creeped into it, and therefore can we really know that we have the Bible today? And I would say that the allegation that the Bible has not been transmitted accurately cannot be upheld by someone who is honestly looking at the evidence. And so this class, this is what we're going to do. We're going to produce evidence. And we're going to let the evidence kind of speak for itself to make these points for us. And so again, we could go back and we could talk about some of the latest books of the New Testament, obviously written, completed by the end of the first century, so by 100 A.D., very likely 95, 96 A.D., the book of Revelation itself, so nearly 2,000 years ago, right? And so again, the question comes about, well, how do we know that the original message penned by the writers is what we have today? That God has, in fact, preserved that message for mankind. Is that even really a biblical concept? And I will present to you, and we'll have a whole lesson that deals with the preservation of God's Word. But let's begin in our story talking about, again, not just translations and things like that. We're going to get to all of that. We're going to get to our English Bible eventually, but we've got to start with what would they write it on? What would they write the Bible down on at that point in time? We've already kind of mentioned clay, right? So there's several things. And the Bible does refer to some of these different materials for writing purposes. Stone, clay, wood and wax, a combination of those things. Metal has been used. Ostraca, or potsherds, broken pottery, in other words. Papyrus, leather, parchments, and I would add in that combo, vellum. And so these different types of materials have been used even outside of biblical writing very clearly. So going all the way back to 3250, as some have dated, at least 3100 by other accounts, talking about the first Pharaoh. So let's just start with stone. To begin thinking about stone, there's several things. And in every region, the earliest material on which writing was found was stone. So this is kind of where writing begins, is on stone, etching things into a piece of stone in some way. Both Egypt, you have Mesopotamia, you have Babylon, all of them using stone for their writing materials, as well as other areas included in that. Hammurabi, you remember the Code of Hammurabi, right? There was this law code that was written. And you see the picture, some 250 laws are etched into this particular stele. And they're called a stele, S-T-E-L-E. And so you have this going back. This is in the Babylonian era. This is around 1755, 1750. The longest, maybe best organized, best preserved legal text from the ancient Near East, written in the Old Babylon dialect, known as Akkadian, and this goes all the way back to the first dynasty in Babylon, and it was inscribed on a basalt or a diorite stele, and then of course they would cover over that as well, and so hopefully those, obviously when it's first written, then those letters and all of that is just going to kind of pop, and you're going to be able to see that much better than obviously a couple thousand years later. But this is in France, and that's where it actually resides now. We have some other pieces of stone as well. You have the Gezer. This is not talking about an old person, an old guy. This is the Gezer calendar. It was a kind of a poem having to do with agricultural activities, and so whatever was going on in the area during those months of the year, especially during the planting, during the harvest, and so forth. There's a poem that is written, and the Gezer calendar has recorded that. And so this was actually on a piece of white limestone. It doesn't really look white as much, but it was a piece of limestone that this was inscribed upon. And it has about 20 words in a very early Hebrew alphabetic script. This dates to about 925, so around the time of King Solomon. You have the Siloam inscription. And so you have another piece of stone. This has to do when King Hezekiah was constructing that tunnel to bring water into Jerusalem, into that area. You have an inscription that tells about that successful completion of this tunnel, Hezekiah's tunnel. It was dug from two different ends, and they met in the middle. And there was, by the way, it was an S-shaped tunnel. It's pretty major feat to accomplish that. But this Siloam inscription actually talks about all of that. And we have 2 Kings 20 and verse 20, 2 Chronicles 32:30 that tell us about Hezekiah's work in this as well. There's another one, and I mentioned this a moment ago, the Mesha stele or the Moabite stone. This is 9th century BC, found in the area east of the Dead Sea, containing 34 lines of Canaanite script, erected when King Mesha of Moab actually had ran a revolt against Israel. And of course, 2 Kings chapter 4, or rather chapter 3, talks about that, beginning in verse 4. Pretty much that whole chapter discusses that. King Mesha wrote about it, or had it etched onto this stele known as the Moabite stele, or the Mesha stele, named after the king himself. And so 2 Kings chapter 3 tells us about that revolt against Israel and what took place. And so, by the way, this is the only inscription outside of Palestine proper that actually mentions the divine name of God, Jehovah. And so that's interesting as well. And so we start seeing the name Jehovah show up in a couple of places. The first time that takes place is this Moabite stele. And so he talks about defeating Israel and so forth, but he mentions the divine name of God. These early specimens of writing existing on stone, again, you have the Bible going side by side with all of that evidence. And so I think that's certainly interesting. Now, when you think about a stone writing, what do you think about? The Ten Commandments, right? So the Ten Commandments, they certainly were written on stone. They were probably not written with that nice circled off top that we like to think of them in that way. Probably much more rectangular in their existence. We have Exodus 31:18, and when he had made an end of speaking with him on Mount Sinai, this is God speaking with Moses, he gave Moses 2 tablets of the testimony, tablets of stone, written with the finger of God. In Exodus 34, verse 1, it begins this way. And the Lord said to Moses, cut 2 tablets of stone like the first ones, and I will write on these tablets the words that were on the first tablets which you broke. And so remember, after he had received that, he goes back down from Mount Sinai, goes back to the Israelite camp, and they are performing all sorts of acts of immorality along with pagan worship that they've seen in Egypt. And so worshiping the golden calf and so forth. And Moses, in his anger, breaks the tables of stone. And so he has to cut more stone and go back up the mountain. And God writes the same things that were listed there on the first. Deuteronomy chapter 10 will give you another passage to look at that as well, verses 1 through 5. But connected directly with stone is the idea of plaster. And so eventually they would also use ink on top of plaster. And so say something had been etched on this piece of stone, but now they want to cover over that and they want to write something else. And so instead of going out and having to, to go and find a mason to cut you a piece of stone that you can write something else on, they found a way to cover over that. And so they would plaster over that and then begin to use a type of ink on top of that. And so we find instances of that as well. You have Lightfoot who mentions this. He refers to Deuteronomy 27, verse 2 and verse 3, at least the last part of verse 2, first part of verse 3. Reading from the American Standard says, "And it shall be on the day when you shall pass over the Jordan unto the land which Jehovah thy God giveth thee, thou shalt set thee up great stones and plaster them with plaster, and thou shalt write upon them all the words of this law." And so later, the words of the law that was given to Moses to begin with, now they're going to write those again. In coming into the land, this was going to be given to them again. And you can read in the New King James, it says it this way, "You shall set up for yourselves large stones and whitewash them." So this idea of plaster, whitewashing something, and then writing over the top of that. And so that's how they would accomplish this. And so we have these passages that remind us. Joshua 8 and verse 32 is another one. I don't have that up on the wall there, but he wrote there upon the stones a copy of the law of Moses, which he wrote in the presence of the children of Israel. And so it's thought that this is exactly what he did. Okay, so when they went into the land, because this is where they were preparing to go into the land, and so this was given to them by way of instructions of God, that this is what they were going to do. So when they get in there, then they would basically whitewash these stones, and they would rewrite the law given to them that was originally written by the very finger of God. And so when Joshua takes the people into the land, eventually this is going to be accomplished. And there we find Joshua 8 and verse 32. He wrote upon the stones a copy of the law. And so this is how they would write then on the stones, not just the idea of etching them out as God did originally, as well as certainly others had done. You have several inscriptions of this kind where you have ink on plaster. They've been discovered fairly recently, at least. One in particular is an Aramaic text. And so we know the Bible was written basically in three languages. You have Hebrew and then Aramaic, and then you have the New Testament being written in Greek, or Koine Greek in particular. But you have an Aramaic text from the plaster of a temple wall in the Jordan Valley. And the first line of the text reads, "This is the record of Balaam, son of Beor." That sounds like somebody we should know, right? We know something about Balaam from Numbers chapters 22 through 24. And so this is a reference to Balaam. And so we have something about his record. Well, it was written in this Aramaic text, and it was written in this style, if you will. It was written on a stone, but it was written on a whitewashed stone with ink on top of that. And so it was actually very formal writing. There was a number of straight lines that were given. It was columned, if you will, kind of like later when they're writing in the scrolls. And so this was a copy of Numbers 22, or Numbers 22 through 24, giving us the idea of the record of Balaam and what had taken place with him. And so there were margins given, but in the upper corners, you have those ruled lines where they wrote, but then you have a heading in red. And so you would have, and that became a very common practice. Even later, when you get to the parchments and you get into around 500, maybe 5th, 6th century, and you start reading some of the, examining some of the scribes' manuscripts that were done, copies that were done of manuscripts and so forth, you find headings like this even later, where there's a heading marked in a different color of ink, such as red. And so, while those headings, by the way, may not necessarily be inspired of God, those scribal headings are very similar to what we see in our Bibles today. You see, if you have a paragraph type Bible, a lot of times there'll be a heading at the top of that paragraph, or at the top of the chapter you may have a heading on that as well. And so that is stone. We have clay, and I know we've got to keep moving here. Clay was probably the most common writing material. It was a whole lot easier to mix some dirt and some water and make some type of clay tablet, once before it completely started to dry. Then you could start to write on it, and then you would either bake it or put it out in the sun for it to dry. And so this was the most common and the easiest, obviously, to get a hold of, and probably some of the, certainly they go back a long ways as well. But that moist clay is made into these tablets, and so this is the material that is referred to in Ezekiel 4. You also, son of man, take a clay tablet, lay it before you, and portray on it a city, Jerusalem. And so think of it this way. Basically, the same way they made bricks for walls, this is the clay that they would use. And so he's saying, basically, take what they're using for a brick and you draw out that city. And so Ezekiel chapter 4 and verse 1. Jeremiah 32:14, take these deeds, both this purchased deed, which is sealed, and the deed which is open, and put them in an earthen vessel, that they may last many days. And so a very important type of document like this, even if it's a clay tablet, might be put yet in some type of jar or buried in the ground until later. That would certainly then keep it safe. And of course, many of those have been unearthed. That's those well-preserved ones that we have. Many of them were done in the very same way. Put them in an earthen vessel so that they may last many days. So again, we have this in Jeremiah. Of course, this is late 500s BC time frame. But certainly they understood and knew how to preserve those writings through the ages. And so that's certainly some evidence as well that points to those things. So again, these clay tablets, they are probably, some give a number somewhere around 500,000 that they have survived from this time period. And so before the time of Christ, let's just put it in that, and that you have some 500,000 clay tablets or pieces of clay tablet. And many of them obviously used for literary purposes. Some of them obviously were used for maybe tax purposes and keeping up with records of goods and services and so forth. The same way that you would now in your computer or in your phone keep up with receipts and so forth. They were doing the same thing back then. It was just a little more difficult to go whip out a clay tablet so that they could keep up with their receipts. But certainly they did it, and we have many of those today. Now, long literary text at that point certainly then would have gone from tablet to tablet. And so a lot of times when some of these have been found, they've been found in those same areas. And so what they would do is when they talk about putting them in an earthen vessel, it might be in a cave somewhere where they have dug out part of the rock and they've placed that clay tablet here, and then almost like a shelf underneath it. Here's page 2 and then page 3 underneath it. You begin to get the idea how these were kept, and certainly they had the ability to do so, and we find very clearly that they did. The chronicles of a number of kings And so I tried to put a corresponding picture with that particular, those clay tablets or pieces of clay tablets that were used. This is Sargon II. He was an Assyrian king. Talks about his capture of Samaria. Why is that even important to us? What happens in 721 BC? The northern kingdom is captured, right? Assimilated into basically Assyrian captivity. And so this is of that time frame. I'll just show you another one real quick. Sennacherib's Annals. This is kind of a hexagon shape, cylinder, if you will. And it details the siege of Hezekiah, King Hezekiah. And so in 701 BC. And so, and you can get a little more detail. If you get online and you search Sennacherib's Annals, you'll see this shape. And in fact, there's basically, there were three different ones. You have the Taylor prism. These are called prisms. The Oriental prism and the Jerusalem prism. There's three different ones, but they give the details of Sennacherib giving chase to Hezekiah, and Hezekiah being shut up, you remember. And so we will pick up here next week and kind of continue with some of the different types of materials. We'll start looking at wood and wax next. And so hopefully this has at least whet your appetite for some more, and that you will want to study some more with us. If you have questions or some things that you want me to answer throughout this lesson, then make sure that you get those to me, and I'll try to make sure that we cover that as we go through at the appropriate spot. But I appreciate everyone's attention tonight.